There's endless mixing advice on the internet, and while lots of it is good, lots of it is not so good. But there is some advice that makes more sense for beginners, or to beginners, that pro mixers either abandon as they grow or straight up disregard, or that has fallen out of fashion over the past few years. So in this video, let's talk about 10 mix tips that pro mixers ignore. And to make it even better, I reached out to mixers that I respect to see what they thought should be on the list, and they sent over some pretty hot takes. Oh, and by the way, if you're new, my name is Adam, and I'm a music producer who makes a new video every week about producing, songwriting, mixing, and more. So if that's something you're into, go ahead and subscribe, and let's dive in. The first bit of mixing advice that lots of pros ignore is mixing in mono and then panning later. You can check in mono if you need to for phase issues, but nowadays almost everyone is listening in stereo. Even our phones have 2 speakers now. So spending time dialing in your mix in a format that you don't intend to use in the end can be a waste of time. Now, one thing you may not find many pros doing is the car test. Now, if your speakers and your room are set up properly, you shouldn't have any glaring problems that you need to double check on something like a car stereo. If you like having reference speakers, a pair of monitors like MixCubes or NS10s work great, or a pair of headphones you like, and then you won't be spending time going back and forth between your car for every mix. If your setup is such that a car test is helpful to you, then don't stop doing it. But don't be surprised if others aren't doing them too. Now, something I've seen change over the past decade is mixers wanting raw files. When I was first starting out as a producer, it was the norm to send totally raw files to mixers, with all the faders set back to 0 and all of the plugins bypassed. Now, I would be roasted by many of the mixers that I work with if I did that to them. If you've got plugins that are solving problems, like EQs that are cutting out annoying frequencies, why would you make the mixer solve those problems too, or make them do a revision if they didn't fix it the same way that you did? And if you spent time getting something dialed in the way it's supposed to sound, why would you make the mixer go back through and recreate that from scratch? Now, I do really quick want to make a disclaimer here and say that these aren't intended to be blanket statements. Obviously, there are going to be pro mixers who stick to these tips, and everyone has their own process. I just really want to emphasize that not everyone works in the same way, and one thing that's game-changing for you or standard for you may be a total hindrance for someone else. That said, if there's anything that you think belongs on this list or anything that you disagree with, let me know in the comments because I want to have a two-way conversation about this stuff. Now, one thing that's helpful for beginners, but lots of pros eventually ditch, is focusing on getting the balance perfect in your mix before adding any plugins. Having a clear picture of what the song should sound like balance-wise, it can be helpful for sure. But once you have an idea of what your mixed instruments should sound like soloed, there's no real reason to put off making those adjustments to individual tracks. I think this is good advice for folks who tend to use the solo button too much, or for mixers who fall down rabbit holes instead of sticking to the process and losing their vision of what the mix should sound like. But if you already know what you want to do with plugins, there's no need to push that off until your fader mix is perfect. Now, one thing you may be surprised to see pro mixers doing is ignoring pretty common protocols, like trying to peak at a certain level or making all their bass frequencies mono. These are best practices that are often repeated, but if it doesn't suit the song, then you should just ignore it. Doing something to every mix because you were told it's the norm is just putting a limit on what you're able to do with regards to mixing the actual song that you're working on. Now, something else that's gone the way of the dodo is leaving master bus processing to the mastering engineer. It's pretty normal in today's day and age to get mixes back that are loud and they have master bus processing baked in. If it helps your mix stand out in a comparison, then that's not a bad thing to say the least, because there's no harm in doing what it takes to get the best sounding mix. So leaving stuff on the table to stick to an outdated idea of mixing may not be the best idea. If you are going to listen to your mix in the car or on AirPods and you have to crank the speakers to the max to be able to hear it clearly, That's not making a great first impression to the artists who have to do the same thing when they're doing mix notes or approvals. And if the mastering engineer really wants you to, you can always take that stuff off later. There's also a common trope that the mixer shouldn't also be the mastering engineer. You'll often hear that you should hire a separate mixer and mastering engineer, but frankly, that's not always the best idea. Let's say you have a hypothetical budget of $10 for a mix and a master, just to make the math easier. If you're going to spend $9 getting the best mixer you can afford to handle the mix, and you have $1 left for mastering, but the mixer is willing to do both for $10, you'll probably get the best result if you have the mixer do both. This may net you a better result than spending $5 on a decent to good mix and then having a $5 mastering engineer try to rescue it. That's not to say that price always correlates with quality, but I think you get the idea. So I'm an advocate for hiring a separate person for each when it makes sense. But there are lots of mixers who can do a bang-up job mastering as well. So don't stress too much if it doesn't make sense for your project or your budget. And in the same vein, it is often repeated that the producer of a song shouldn't also be the mixer. And much like the previous one, there's no reason you should feel bad about having your producer mix the song as well, if that's something they're good at. Nowadays, mix as you go is becoming a standard style of production, where the producer does a lot of mix work between sessions to make sure the song is coming along well. And because of this, typically the artist and the producer are on the same page about how things should sound. So if it makes sense for the producer to also tackle the mix, there's no set in stone reason not to do it. One piece of mix advice that gets thrown around tons is that you should focus on sound selection and production choices first. But the truth of the matter is, if you are just mixing the song and that's it, then you don't really have a say in any of those choices. I've spoken with so many producers and mixers who talk about how their mixes improved as they got better at producing and recording, and going back a few steps and improving sound selection and arrangement will undoubtedly help the final mix. And in the same vein, focusing on getting it right at the source is common advice for music makers recording live instruments. And it does make mixing easier to have amazing sounding raw recordings. Garbage in, garbage out. It's a real thing. But sometimes you will be asked to rescue mediocre performances and recordings, and you'll be tasked with turning that garbage into gold. Now, obviously, it may be better for the artist and producer to re-record, but it's not always practical or even possible. And that's a conversation that's hard to have as a mixer. If one mixer is telling the artist they should go re-record, and then another sends in a solid mix, which one is getting the next job? Probably the second one. I've seen some folks work miracles as mixers with pretty meh recordings. So if you want to impress your clients, be the mixer who turns their bedroom recordings into solid gold, or at least as close to gold as you can get it. Now, one of my buddies that I asked about this let me know that he's pretty lazy with naming his tracks, especially if the session isn't getting sent to anyone else. And while I'm usually very on top of that, I get it. I'm at the point where I have my typical track order sorted out. So even if they had no names at all, I could pick them out just based on where they are in the session and what the waveforms look like. And while I'm on top of naming tracks, I personally don't color code any of them. I just leave the default Pro Tools colors. But other people are dead set on color coding everything. So I guess the main takeaway on this one is that if it works for you, roll with it. And don't worry about living up to someone else's standards when it comes to things like track names and color coding, especially if it's never going to leave your desk. Another big shift I've seen recently in pro mixing circles is the opinions on reference tracks. Now, I'm someone who definitely uses reference tracks, but I've spoken with so many mixers and producers who don't, and they tell their clients to not bother sending them in. And I get it. One thing that happens often is an artist will send you a reference track, so you copy their instrument levels, you shape your mix to sound similar to the reference overall, and then the artist has a page full of revisions for you. And that's because they like the reference song a lot, but they don't really like anything specifically about the mix itself. So to mitigate this, I usually will pick out my own reference tracks to listen to if needed, of songs that I think have a similar mix to what I'd be going for, and I just use those. Now, others will just mix based on what's in front of them, and I'm starting to move more in that direction as I do more mixing myself. And as you grow, chances are you will too. Oh, and by the way, I do want to tell you that the Producer Planner is now available. So if you didn't know, I've been working for a long time on a planner for music producers specifically that only has forms relevant to us. It has project planners, lyric sheets, all kinds of stuff that you're going to want. And I am giving it away for free. That's right. So if you want to print out your own PDFs of the planner, then I will email them to you if you click on the link in the description. Or if you want to buy a physical one, those are on sale now as well. So if you want to get a producer planner now, go ahead and click the link in the description. So there you have it, 10 bits of mixing advice that pro mixers ignore. Now, if you want to take your mixing game up a notch and start sending out pro mixes yourself, then watch this video next.